No one knows when she's coming back.
Maybe Monday.
Maybe Monday. Oh no, she told me she's going to be here on Saturday for the test, practice test. So I don't know. All right, just to review last night's screencast, really briefly, as Mr. Trokin really went over the period 8 issues in terms of the oil embargo. You have stagflation, you have political scandals, and again, really keep in mind that under Richard Nixon, public trust of the federal government from that point on, it's like a turning point, has declined. I mean, if you ask Americans today, do you trust your government? You have very few that openly say that they do. And not that I'm trying to create some type of scandal, but people just have that sense of distrust and disdain for Congress in particular. But if you were to look prior, I mean, even like look at World War II, Americans had a lot more trust in their government than they do today. And then, of course, you have some foreign policy failures and the Iranian hostage crisis, which Carter doesn't really help by any means. And again, you have this general sense of decay. Then come in Reagan. We talked about Reaganomics, and he's sort of looked at again as this model for Republicans and conservatives today. I mean, think, for example, trickle-down economics. That's been a big thing touted by conservatives, that if you have tax cuts for the wealthy, that the extra money that they're saving, they're going to be spending, and hence it's going to be trickling down to the average American. That is also a controversial economic theory as to whether or not it works. But you do have tax cuts. You're going to see deregulation, shrinking the size of government. That's big on Reagan's part. Did you like how Mr. Trokin was like, oh, hey, Mr. Reagan? Did you see that? No, you didn't watch that part? No. Okay, whatever. Growth of the budget deficit is definitely, you're going to see that under Reagan as well. And you're going to see eventually how George H.W. Bush is going to lose in the 92 election after he's saying, read my lips, no new taxes. That's the problem with media today, is that anytime you say anything, especially in the era of having YouTube, it can be replayed, it can be aired on television, no new taxes, and what does he do? He raises taxes. But one successful thing that he does do is in the Middle East in terms of getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and protecting Kuwait being a very small country. And it's also successful in the sense that it's a victory, unlike really Vietnam, really like Korea. Those weren't really victories like you saw in World War II, where you had a clear winner. But certainly with the Gulf War, you're going to see that happen. And then you're going to see the end of the Cold War, officially under George H.W. Bush. And let's now go into Bill Clinton in the 1992 election. So, he is the first baby boom president, new generation. He is also, of course, a non-World War II veteran, unlike his prior predecessors. Interestingly enough, this is also going to be the first Democrat. Did I put blanks in this? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. This is going to be the first. He's going to be the first non-World War II veteran, first Democrat in 12 years. Sort of ending that conservative momentum. And this is going to be a three-way race. Really, people hated Washington at this point, almost relative akin to today. There's a stagnant economy, you have high deficits, you just have a general disillusionment. And that, of course, remember, starts with Nixon. Also in 1992, Congress passes the 27th Amendment, and that was in response to people hating them. It basically stated that Congress cannot raise its pay until the next session. So this Congress can raise its pay, but it won't take effect until the next new Congress comes into effect. And that was, again, representative of the general hatred that people had for Congress at this point and distrust. So you have a three-way race. You have Perot, who's running as an independent. He's a Texas billionaire. He's anti-Washington. He's anti-deficit. And he captures a lot of people's feelings, sort of in a way like Donald Trump does. I mean, he's not, I wouldn't classify Donald Trump necessarily as a Republican. I wouldn't classify him as a Democrat either. He's sort of like that Ross Perot person in the sense that he's capturing people's disgust with government today. He does actually pretty well in the popular vote. He gets about 18-19% of it. Does not get one electoral vote. But he does so well, he gets the most votes for a third-party candidate, as many since Teddy Roosevelt during the Bull Moose Party, if you remember that election of 1912. But nevertheless, Bill Clinton will become president. He does have a weak mandate. When we talk about a weak mandate, if he had overwhelmingly won the election, that would mean that people 100% supported him. Since you have a three-way race, it's a weak mandate, so it's going to be difficult to get a lot of his policies passed. But you notice that he's going to capture the Northeast. These are Democratic strongholds. Also notice he gets some conservative states as well, Arkansas in particular. Any idea why Arkansas? Sorry, there's an ant on my desk. Arkansas. Seems like a random state to get. He was actually the governor of Arkansas prior to this point. So you typically will win your home state. So some of the reforms and challenges. Hillary Clinton is not your typical first lady who embarks on some type of project and stays behind the scenes. In a way, you can almost contrast her with or compare her to Eleanor Roosevelt, that she's a go-getter, in the sense that she actually tries to pass what was known at the time as Hillary Care, where you'd have some type of medical service industry that was more or less universal. It fails completely. There's no support for it in Congress. So that was a failure. And again, weak mandate when Bill Clinton becomes president by the voters. Another thing that happens is in 1994, during the midterm congressional elections, House Speaker Newt Gingrich, he forms what he calls his contract with America in the sense that he says he's going to rail against the budget deficit. He's going to be going after welfare programs. And because they have majorities of Republicans in the House and the Senate, they're able to get a lot done in this type of conservative agenda. Because at this point, people thought that, I mean, there was this image of, have you ever heard of, what are they called, like Cadillac queens? Or they call them welfare queens, where there was like a few people who were on welfare who were driving Cadillacs, and that was seen as like they were bilking the system. And sure, they probably were, but it wasn't necessarily representative of everybody. Nevertheless, this leads to Bill Clinton supporting the Welfare Reform Act of '96, which is going to reduce welfare grants. It's going to mandate that they seek work, and it also restricts the amount of time. And this is going to be supported by Clinton. So he actually goes after welfare as well, has to work with Republicans. Clinton will once again win another decisive victory. You see Perot running again as a third-party candidate. Does not do as well as he did in '92. Clinton overwhelmingly winning in the electoral vote, a little bit closer in terms of the popular vote, but nevertheless will get a second term. One thing that he's going to sign, as you just read about today, is NAFTA. This is supposed to help with respect to sort of stimulating trade amongst Canada, Mexico, the United States. To some extent, it's going to export manufacturing jobs to Mexico, which is going to sort of reverse the tide. If you remember, under Reagan, you had more manufacturing jobs coming in. You have a lack of mobility of workers. This, to some extent, will also hurt Mexican farmers, as you'll have increased American competition in the agricultural sector. You will also have deficits in terms of with the United States in terms of trading. Typically with deficits, when you trade, you want to have an equal amount of imports and an equal number of exports, or preferably more exports because you'd be selling more. You will see some added deficits as a result of NAFTA for the United States. And then also the World Trade Organization, this idea of pro-trade throughout the United States and beyond the United States borders with other countries. Again, this is a period of globalization. Okay, and the final couple of slides here. So the dot-com boom. Under Clinton, this is the beginning of when you see computers, the internet coming about, and this leads to tremendous economic growth, especially in the stock market. If you look on this slide, the NASDAQ, which is an indicator on the stock market, if you've seen it, specifically with technology, notice how in 1995 where it stands and how it dramatically increases, peaks in 1999, going up nearly more than 10 times what it was in about 1994. And very indicative of sort of this post or current dot-com boom, if you will. I guess similar to, if you will, the 1920s when you have a lot of money flowing, especially amongst the wealthy. But it's a generally good period. So good of a period that the United States' budget is in a surplus. I mean, we haven't heard that word in a very long time, surplus, with respect to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that were being fought, and then on top of that, the global recession, which led to increased spending. So you actually had a surplus in the budget under Clinton, and you see here George Bush inheriting that to about $236 billion. Okay, George Bush in 2000, what were you all, one at this time? One. You remember the election pretty well? George Bush, of course, the son of George H.W. Bush, is running for president, and he's up against Al Gore, who was the vice president of Bill Clinton. And this is a very controversial election because Florida became the contested state. There was a lot of voting malfunctions, and even though I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Even though Gore wins the popular vote, you see, he gets 48.4%. He actually loses the Electoral College, and it came down to Florida. This went through the courts, and they ultimately ruled in favor of George Bush, and George Bush wins the election. Many Democrats actually blame it on Ralph Nader, who ran as an independent and took some votes away from Al Gore. Ralph Nader is very famous for being like a consumer safety guy. For example, the reason why you have mandatory seat belts is because of Ralph Nader. He's also big on the environment as well. So George Bush will become the president, lost the popular vote, won the electoral vote. One thing that he's going to do that's very Reagan-esque, tax cuts for especially the wealthy. You'll see, again, a good amount of money going into the upper top 10, 20% of society. You have more deregulation, meaning that you have fewer restrictions being placed upon businesses by the federal government. You have less environmental oversight, again, with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that's sort of seen as an agency that's anti-business, that's more focused on the environment. Under Bush, a lot of that is scaled back. Of course, you're going to have the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of 9/11. One thing that Bush is going to also do is try to privatize Social Security, meaning that it's no longer going to be part of the government and you would fund your own account. That actually becomes very unpopular. Senior citizens typically don't like their Social Security being touched, and as a result, that's going to fail. You will also see immigration becoming an issue as the growth of undocumented immigrants coming into the United States significantly increases. I think they estimate between 11 and 12 million undocumented immigrants are in the country today, and you see a heavy growth of that under Bush. And then the final thing about the Bush era economy is that you had a housing bubble that's going to basically collapse and cause the 2008 recession. Basically, when you go for a mortgage to buy a house, they now run credit checks, they see what your income is, and they verify everything. It's a very strict process. Under the Bush administration, basically anybody could get a loan for a house. Katie could say, oh yeah, I make $1 million. They would take you on that, on your word. They wouldn't even check it, give you $1 million. You buy your house, and then you're unable to afford mortgage payments. And then you had this massive amount of foreclosures following the 2008 bubble that pops in the housing market, and that we're still to some extent dealing with today. I think in Vernon they say that there's like 500 or so foreclosures, and even Sussex County has just a ton. So this is something that's going to take a while to get through. But certainly with the Bush era economy, you do definitely have some boom, but you also have a bust at the end in the housing sector, which is going to lead to the Great Recession.